Hey everyone, so just a few hours ago, Starshine published what appears to be a guide for Carnis on how to interact with Name the Trade. He laid out a total of 9 points, which Mason, Terminus, and I will be addressing in this video. To me personally, it seems more like it's a guide on how to avoid answering Name the Trade. Um, but before we dive into the commentary, here is my advice to the Carnis community. Just answer Name the Trade. Um, Otherwise, this is what we are going to be saying to you.
I take my dick, I bend you over and just insert it in that ass and just fucking smack you, right? That's what happens if you actually talk to me.
It has something to do with Name the Trade. It's unclear what exactly he is trying to do, but my interpretation is he is trying to give people responses, give meat eaters responses when they're confronted with Name the Trade. Um, so yeah, we just want to make a small commentary one by one and tell you what we think about it. So basically, number one is NTT is not an argument for veganism. If you came into a conversation to talk about veganism, NTT does not do that unless the NTTer is willing to put forward some inference that concluded that um, from the conclusion of the dialogue to veganism. If they refuse, then you should refuse to do NTT if your goal is to talk about veganism. So my first comment on that, on the first sentence, NTT is not an argument for veganism. Sure, I agree. It's a dialectic. Um, and then the second part is very weird. If you came into a conversation to talk about veganism, NTT does not do that, unless the entityr is willing to put inference that concludes to veganism. Um, no, actually, running Name the Trait is very conducive when it comes to my goals to talk about veganism. Um, yeah, so I guess Cartesian and Terminus would have a lot to say here.
Yeah, I'll just immediately say I don't know why number one is worded as if to imply that a necessary condition for, quote, talking about veganism requires that there's some deductively valid argument that concludes with something along the lines of you ought be vegan. It's like, what? No, I could just talk about like some vegan Olympians, or I could talk about someone I made vegan the other day, or what I think about veganism. And those would all be what normal people would classify as talking about veganism. So I don't know why this is being posed as some necessary condition for something being considered to be talking about veganism. That's just bizarre.
Yeah, so I agree. So it seems like by talking about veganism, he has an interpretation of that that literally means or involves somebody giving an argument where the conclusion is you are go vegan. It seems to me to be a kind of idiosyncratic interpretation of what it means to talk about something, even particularly an ethical topic. Because it's not uncommon at all for people to talk about ethical topics and not present arguments in that way. Rather, they have like broad discussions where they exchange questions, etc. So this first point is just about the idiosyncrasy of the interpretation of the lines. But even if that is what he means, then we would just have different goals in the conversation. Because when it is said that somebody ought go vegan, I take ought claims and normative claims to be indexed to the values of agents. And so if ought is indexed to me, they ought go vegan. But if ought is indexed to the person in question, I actually am not convinced that they ought go vegan because I'm actually not convinced that they have the relevant values. They might as well be some sort of evil or crazy person. And so because of that, I'm not going to give an argument for a proposition that I'm not even convinced of.
Right, and also like if we understand like value to be indexed in the way that you described, like the meat eater demanding that I give him an argument that concludes that according to their values they ought go vegan. How am I going to do that if I don't know their values? I need to ask them question and inquire about their values and then see whether or not it's true that they ought go vegan is like entailed. Um, Yeah, so, and the way I'm going to do that is using dialectics like name the trait, inquiring about their values. Um, Anything else to that point?
I'll just make one last quick point. Like, if there's something being implied here that um, doing anything other than giving a deductively valid argument wouldn't motivate someone to be vegan or something like this, that's also just stupid. Like, look, I can hire someone to paint my house, right? I could pay them $100 and they're going to paint my house. We wouldn't say something like, well, if you didn't give them a deductively valid argument that they ought to paint the house, then they wouldn't be motivated to paint your house. It's like, no, there's things that motivate people other than just deductively valid arguments. Like, I don't know, this just sounds deranged. Like, in case there's any implication that in number one, NTT wouldn't motivate people to be vegan, I also would just disagree with that. And in case there's any future ones we encounter, I'd just be repeating that point. So,
Yeah, that's great. I think that's enough for point one. So point two is like very interesting. There is nothing wrong with not having an immediate answer to entity. Ethical positions that lead um, to only the conclusions you want are quite difficult to construct, and major normative theories are considered to have problems. If leading ethicists don't have satisfying answers, why would you? Okay, so the first bit, there is nothing wrong with not having an immediate answer to name the trait. Not sure what he means. One interpretation that I give is just to um, omit the word immediate, and then I read there is nothing wrong with not having an answer to name the trait. Well, if that's the right interpretation, there is, right? Because if your answer is, I don't know, I have no answer to name the trait, then you would be committed to not knowing whether or not it's ethically okay to factory farm a human with a single cow hair, right? That's going to be conclusion of you not knowing um, where the value is lost when you're asked the name the trait question. Now, the other interpretation I have is when somebody is saying, where the meat eater is saying, "Hey, you are asking me a good question. I don't have an immediate answer. I need to think about it." Okay, well, if he says something like that, I would be like, okay, sure, yeah, think about it, go reflect, and we can continue the conversation sometimes in the future when you believe you have an answer that would stand up to a counterexample, right? And I would actually prefer them to go reflect, right? Because I think that there is no answer that wouldn't lead to crazy entailments. Um, yeah, what do you guys think?
I mean, I'll just say right off the bat, like, if there's an implication that I would shame someone if they say, I'm going to have to think about that, it's actually the opposite. Every time I encounter someone, they seem to want to give really stupid answers right away, um, or complain that I'm asking for an answer. But whenever I come across someone who says, I'm gonna have to think about that, like they really give an honest I would never shame them for that. If anything, that's like a good sign that they're an honest interlocutor. And as far as the other stuff mentioned, I mean, they're saying ethical positions that lead to only the conclusion you're quite difficult to. It's like, okay, whether or not you think it's difficult to construct doesn't tell me anything about whether they've answered NTT. And also, I don't know why it's talking about leading ethicists struggling to give, like, decent major normative theories that would capture all cases that people are comfortable with, because NTT is not about that. Like, you can be a utilitarian deontologist, threshold deontologist, or whatever the fuck else, and it'd be compatible with all the different views of being okay with killing both humans and animals, neither humans nor animals, or just humans, and not animals, or vice versa. So those overarching normative ethical views don't actually have much relation.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely because you can be vegan for utilitarian reason or virtue ethics reason. So I don't understand why he is bringing normative theories here. We can move to the next point, unless Cartesian
Well,
has something to add.
yeah, I did want to add that, like, when he says there is nothing wrong, one thing he could mean is something like wrong in the sense of what is expected of a typical person in this position. So when he says there's nothing wrong with not having an immediate answer, he might mean something like, well, you're not doing anything, you're not like failing to meet what's expected of somebody who's presented with something like this. So that sense of wrongness, and that might be true. But on a different sense of wrongness, or at least on different norms we're considering to undergird wrongness, it might be wrong. So, for example, if somebody were to ask you, hey, you're okay with killing black people, but not white people, why? And you say something like, I don't know. Well, that just might be considered wrong to a large amount of people. And it might be considered wrong because you have some considerable different normative treatment of two different groups that is perceived as unjust. And you have apparently no good response to why. So it might be seen wrong under those guises. And so if he's saying that that wouldn't be seen as wrong to a large amount of people, that also gets into a further empirical issue. So that's just in case of the interpretation that he's saying. Like if that's in case he's talking about that sense of wrongness.
Yeah, go ahead, Terminus. You wanted to say something.
Oh, I'm happy to move on. Yeah,
Okay,
that covers pretty much everything.
cool, yeah. Point number 3. Non-vegans should be aware that failing to account for their difference in treatment does not mean vegans have a good normative ethic either. Terminus, you maybe want to
Yeah,
start
I
with.
immediately just want to say I don't know what the fuck this has to do with NTT. Like, look, NTT is running an internal consistency test. I don't know what your interlocutor's view has to do with your view that's having the consistency test run on it. So I'm just not sure why point 3 is being mentioned as some sort of, hitchhiker's guide for dealing with NTT. Like, knowing anything about your interlocutor's view is not going to help you answer NTT. Just right out the gate.
Yeah, I want to say that like if his goal here is to help people engage with NTT in some way, this is actually going to be detrimental to his goal because there is some reasonable suspicion that it'll give people the interpretation that saying something like this is going to help them address NTT or respond to the questions adequately, where it won't at all, because in no way for somebody who's dealing with the entity dialogue is the normative theory of the other person relevant, and in no way is this fact going to help them.
Yeah, exactly right. And there is actually a funny analogy on that point because I interpret that point as basically the meat eater saying, like, look, I failed to account for my difference in treatment between animals and humans, but that doesn't mean that your view is not problematic in some other way. Your normative ethical view is not problematic in some other way. So to me, this seems like, and maybe Terminus want to flesh out the example here with the slavery one, just so people understand how it sounds.
Yeah, just imagine like a rapist talking to someone who owns slaves and telling the slave owner to name the trait, and the slave owner fails to name the trait between the black man and the white man. And then the slave owner responds with, but okay, I failed to name a trait, but that doesn't mean that, your normative ethical views are good, right? Does that absolve the slave owner of any of his own internal moral failures? No. It doesn't even matter if the other person is a rapist, whether they're Jesus or whether they're Chat GPT. The point is that you have failed to justify your actions by demonstrating some relevant symmetry breaker between the two creatures that you're treating differently.
Yep. Can move on to the next one unless Cartesian wants to
Yep.
say something here.
I think we've covered it pretty well.
Cool. Okay. So point number 4, combining previous points, if you don't find a convincing answer to NTT, you likely still don't have a compelling reason to switch to veganism. First, you should be convinced that not knowing is problematic. Second, if you're convinced that you would like to switch due to your ignorance, you would probably want to switch into something you do understand, and moving to veganism will not inherently provide you that. It would make sense to ask vegans for an alternative normative ethic and see if it and its implications make sense to you. So,
Immediately, there's a strange claim being made at the beginning when it says you likely still don't. It says combining previous points, if you still don't find a convincing answer to NTT, you likely, if you don't find a convincing answer to NTT, you likely still don't have a compelling reason to switch to veganism. Where's the evidence for that?
yeah, that's
Like,
empirical claim.
if by likely they mean something like it's just possible, okay, sure, that sounds trivial. If by likely they mean it's some non-trivial amount of possibility, fine, I'll even grant that. But if they want to say something like it's more likely than not, or it's at least noticeably likely, like, I don't know, a 20% chance or something like this, it's like, how the fuck did you come to that determination? Is it just through your personal experience or something trashy like that? I mean, I just don't know why that empirical claim is being made.
Yeah, me neither. I just know that, look, I've talked with people when it comes to personal experience. The person is saying, hey, I failed to answer and name the trade. And the reason why I'm switching to veganism is because I see that there is no morally relevant difference between humans and animals, right? So that's being flushed out of my view. And this gives me a reason to not support the torturing and killing of animals.
Right. Number 4 is a long one, by the way. So there's a lot to
Yeah,
cover. Go ahead, Confusion.
there's some things I want to point out is like so he says if you're convinced you'd like to switch due to your ignorance, you'd probably want to switch into something you do understand, and moving into veganism will not inherently provide you that. One interpretation, because like what he's saying is unclear, like could have, and so like there's the point of the clarity of what he's saying, like whereas he could have stated it in a much more, you know, comprehensible way. And so we have to like give a lot of interpretations of what he's saying here. One interpretation he's saying is that you um, currently don't know what you drums. So if you want to switch to a view that tells you that, then switching to veganism will not necessarily help, because switching to veganism might not necessarily tell you where value drops off. And that's for the person who's switching because he doesn't know where value drops off. So if all we say is that, you know, switching to veganism, if you switch because you're ignorant, then switching won't necessarily absolve you of your ignorance. If that's all he's saying, then that's trivial. But first, this is not going to help anyone in any way engage with NTT, which is this aforementioned stated goal. This will not help anybody deal with anything in the conversation. And it might even mislead people into thinking that this somehow will help them in the conversation as they're presenting responses to what the question being asked. But there's another point, which is that if somebody were to switch because of their ignorance, somebody could still be ignorant and still have a good reason to be vegan, which, for example, they might think that due to their background values, that they should adopt a precautionary principle with regards to animal consumption, precisely because they don't know where value drops off, but they don't find it extremely implausible that it drops off in a way, or the value is cashed out in a way that are favorable to veganism. And so that's going to motivate them to adopt a precautionary principle, and they're going to have a good reason to go vegan nevertheless.
Yeah, and there is one other sentence I want to address here. He says, first, you should be convinced that not knowing is problematic, and not knowing I take it to be, I don't know answer to name the trait. Look, this is going to lead to hilarious reductios as mentioned previously, like you don't know whether or not it's ethical on your view to kill a human with a single cow hair for food. you wouldn't know whether or not that's ethical or unethical. And like, look, you maybe say you don't find that problematic, but that's going to be the entailment, that you don't know whether or not it's ethical to send this person to Auschwitz, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's for clarity. That's if somebody were to say they have no idea, as in they're not able to narrow the range of value dropping off in trade equalization. So that would be a consequence of that position. But furthermore, this idea that he asserts that you should be convinced that not knowing is problematic, right? This is not going to help anybody in any way engage with NTT, which is his aforementioned stated goal. This might mislead people into thinking or in the discussion of NTT, asking the proponent to deliver an argument where the conclusion is not knowing is somehow quote unquote problematic. But the proponent of NTT does not need to take a position on whether or not knowing is problematic or not. They could just as easily run NTT and believe not knowing is not problematic in any way. They could just as easily run NTT and believe that not knowing is the worst thing in the world. And so this is just another point about how this is conflicting with his goal. He said his goal is to help people deal with NTT, or at least deal with the rhetoric associated with it. But this in a conversation has the potential of making the person perform worse in the conversation by demonstrating a lack of understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, right. Um, that's interesting that you mentioned that. Um, because he tries to say that he doesn't have anything against people running name the trade, and he wants to encourage good conversations, but that sentence doesn't seem to conduce to that goal. Um, and one more thing before we move to the next one, in the last sentence of point 4, he says, it would make sense to ask vegans for alternative normative ethic and see if it and its implication makes sense to you first. Like, look, the proponent of name the trade, so far as I'm concerned, doesn't need to have any commitments to any normative ethical position. They could be, you know, they could be unclear of what their position is. They could be utilitarian, they could be threshold deontologists, they could be virtue ethicists, they could be ethical egoists or whatever. I'm not understanding. And like, Shadow, you would grant that all normative ethical positions could lead to veganism, or one could be vegan for like utilitarian concerns, for example. So why they need to provide like a whole normative ethical framework um, to run name the trade, right? That seems very unreasonable request.
I want to add once again to build off the point you're making here, is that this is just further and further detracting from his goal. There is again, not unreasonable suspicion that people will read these comments, and when in a discussion about name the trade, they will start demanding of the proponent or their interlocutor to provide a normative framework of their own, which will be a complete failure to engage with NTT. And so once again, if his goal is to help people in their interactions with name to trade, he's just only detracting from his goal. And I'm almost shocked at how incompetent a post like this could be when there was no pressure to put it out. There was time to write it out, and there was time to make sure that it conduced with the goals aforementioned. And I'm kind of shocked how it could turn out like this.
Yep. Moving on to the next point, unless Terminus wants to say something here, I think that was...
No, I'm ready to move on.
Perfect. So, point number 5. Many entities just say their normative ethics are threshold deontology, but have no list of deontic rules, what utility consists of, or a threshold. Their ethics tend to be more vague than anything I could come up with. If you're looking to switch into clarity, you may want to know that they don't have it.
No, immediately you don't want to know what your interlocutor's normative ethical view is. That has no relevance to whether your view is internally consistent or leads to reductio. I don't know why this is being mentioned. And I'm going to do a little bit of mind reading here. I feel like Starshine just has some weird idea in his head that the goal when engaging with the NTT is just to show that you're like not worse than them or something. I think he's giving people a false idea of what they're going to be getting into with NTT, and it's going to make people do piss poor.
Precisely, and yeah, Cartesian, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is just continually re-emphasizing this point. But his goal is to improve people's interactions with NTT. He stated beforehand that he wants to help people deal with the rhetoric associated with NTT. And all he's doing here is plausibly just hurting people in their efforts to deal with NTT, because somebody plausibly will read this post, and what they're going to be compelled to do is to question the normative theory of their opponent or their interlocutor and raise issues or objections to the vagueness of their deontic values, which is completely irrelevant to an NTT interaction. And so this plausibly has the potential to make people fare worse in dealing with NTT.
Yep, exactly. I think yeah, you guys made the good points here. I don't have much to add here, just besides saying that, normative ethical theories, nothing turns out on them in the name the trade dialectic, or at least not as much, right? So he's bringing a couple of points already that, he's talking about normative ethics, and yeah, to me, it seems that this may introduce more and more confusion when it comes to name the trade. Should we continue to point number 6? I think so.
Yeah.
Sure.
Cool. So point 6. People should be aware of bottom-up ethical approaches. Most of the pool of NTT tends to be assuming a top-down approach. Go with whatever you want, but not a lot of people are aware of bottom-up, and it's a shame. I have no idea what he's saying here, so I would just let it to you guys. Maybe you have interpretation.
Yeah, I'll start by saying it's not worded very well, but since we're trying to work with whatever the fuck Starshine gave us here, I'll just give you my best interpretation. Maybe he's talking about forming your normative ethic by looking at some individual situations and just generally judging how you feel, rather than starting with some sort of deep introspection and thinking, all right, is it, utility that I value? Is it rights violations that I value? And then after you've got that, starting to apply it downward onto the particular situations. Now, I don't know what the point of mentioning any of this is, because again, NTT is not looking for bottom up or top down approaches. None of this is really relevant. All that's being asked is for a symmetry breaker between the two creatures that you said you're going to treat differently. That's all.
Right, exactly. And I had a very similar interpretation where a bottom-up approach to normative ethics would be something like considering your values that are more fundamental, and then adopting a framework of principles that serve the basis for a normative theory, where a top-down approach to normative ethics would be considering your values on a range of particularized cases, and then constructing a framework that best explains your judgments on a range of particularized cases. And this will not help anybody in dealing with NTT whatsoever. It's completely irrelevant. Somebody who's giving NTT could have either view of the best way to construct a normative theory, and it would be completely irrelevant to the discussion. And no matter what approach you have, it will not help you in any way with dealing in the discussion. Now, to be charitable to him here, one thing he might be saying is that if you think about ethics in a particular way, that might help you better in the discussion. So on this interpretation, he's not necessarily saying that it will help you in the discussion against the proponent, but he's more so saying that if you yourself consider these approaches, you might have some advantage in future interactions. And I see no reason to think that. So, I mean, it's not entirely implausible, but I see no reason to think that. And even if that were his interpretation, it's not clearly stated in this post. It's hard, like you have to do some interpretive work to like come to the conclusion that that might be what he's saying. So if his goal is to improve people's interactions with NTT, he certainly isn't helping by the way he wrote this out. But another thing he mentions is that he says that most of the pool of NTT is assuming a top-down approach. And that also might mislead people into thinking somehow that the NTT proponent is assuming a top-down approach. And so after reading his comments, somebody in an NTT interaction might ask the proponent to justify this top-down approach, which again is conflicting with the goal of improving interactions, because you're just muddying the waters and potentially confusing people into thinking that somehow this will deal with anything in NTT.
Yeah, that was a good point at the end there, which is that they're now going to be entering NTT with this interpretation that there's some sort of, position that your interlocutor is taking, which is that there is this bottom up or top down approach, right? When no such thing is being posited, and then they're just going to look like a non-tracking mess.
Perfect. Okay, moving on to the next one. Point 7, that's a very interesting one. It's rarely clear what level of specificity any entity wants in their answers before they stop asking questions, as per my convo with Avi. Non-vegans should learn to ask what level of specificity the asker wants to not accept vague answers to that question. Okay, so I want to start with this one. So my first thought here is, if the meat eater is asking me what level of specificity you want, I would just say, give me the best you can. It's a good start to the conversation. And we take it from there. Now, if they say that, if they for some reason refuse to like specify, I would say something that Cartesian typically asks, which is the question of, how about if there was like a mentally disabled human who has the same cognitive abilities like an animal? Would you be okay with factory farming this human for food? And they have 3 answers: yes, no, I don't know. If they answer with like yes, that would be absurd so far as I'm concerned. Their values would be very revealed. If they answer with I don't know, same story, they're unaware whether or not it's okay to kill mentally disabled person. And if they answer with a no, here is where it gets interesting. Now, given that the human has the same cognition, same level of cognition as an animal, right? The relevant differences that are like being left on the table are going to be are going to have to do something with how the being looks like, right? So I can like start specifying from that point on for the meat eater. If they refuse to be specific, I can ask them questions like, well, are you okay with factory farming that being if it had the same level of intelligence or cognitive abilities as a cow and had like a cow head, right? So presumably they can answer that, right? And I can keep going until I get a satisfying like answer, or see where their values lead. And yesterday we had like interaction with another person who, who basically agreed that the being, like there are 2 beings, they look identical as a cow. They have the same cognitive abilities as a cow, but one of them has a little bit of a human DNA, and it's okay to factory farm this one and not the other one. And just for the people who are like watching, here is a picture of how that one looks, so you can see what I'm talking about. Basically, the absurdity here is that those beings wouldn't differ in any important way. Nevertheless, his value judgment would differ when it comes to his treatment, right? And the treatment is like sending one to death pretty much, and torture.
Yeah, there's some
Right.
pretty crazy shit that's gonna happen if you go down that route. But I just want to start by saying to number 7, it says it's not clear what level of specificity they want. It's like, well, look, the question is more like, what level of specificity do you want to give to try to avoid reductio? Because the less specificity you give, the higher chance there's going to be that you're going to end up in reductio. And the reason why is because every being that you don't specify you're not okay with killing, that you're instead agnostic about killing, is going to be a potential reductio. Like if we have, a human with a single cow hair and we ask, are you okay with killing that? And you say you're not sure, right? Then that's going to look horrendous. So the question is more, how much specificity do you want to give? Frankly, if you're asking what I want, Starshine, you can give me whatever the fuck is the most that you're capable of giving. All I want is the best that you're able to give. But if the best you're able to give is, I don't know, like no specificity whatsoever, that's going to satisfy me in the discussion. I don't know about you, but that's all I have to say there.
Yeah, so I want to add, it depends what he means by specificity. One interpretation of specificity is something like this: specificity in terms of the point in the trade equalization process where value drops off. Now, the answer to that question is just as best as you honestly are aware of, right? So if you want to know how much specificity I want with regards to when value drops off, all right, sorry, 1 second.
In the meantime, I'll just mention. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I can get. So if the question is about specificity with regards to when value drops off, I would answer, well, as best as you can honestly provide given what you're aware of, right? Now, if the question is specificity about vagueness, for example, people might answer with vague terms like personhood, right? If the question is how specific do I want those terms to be precisified, well, the answer to that is just whatever allows me to understand what the person is saying.
Now, just in case, because we're going to be posting this and people are going to nag at you if you don't point this out, just in case someone says, well, what do you mean by understand? Do you mean understand vaguely or understand specifically? What would be your response to that?
Right. So so I guess it would be just the level of understanding that allows me to make claims about what the person is saying. So, for example, it gives me some general sense about what the extension of personhood is. If we're using person as an example, it allows me to make further claims about things being persons and things being not. Right. So, in other words, just some level of clarity that allows me to make claims using the term, that allows me to have a good idea of which things fall under the term and which don't.
Right. The way I would mention is something like I would need an understanding of it enough such that I have narrowed down in the trait equalization process more worlds where they are and are not okay with killing than I had before they gave me the trait or set of traits. If I haven't narrowed it down any further, then I haven't gotten enough of an understanding of it. I need to narrow it down such that there are more worlds I'm sure of that they're not okay with killing.
Right, pretty good. Um, Moving on to the next one. So there are only 2 points left. I would read point 9 first and then 8. So 9 is whenever a vegan pulls from a list of possible counterexamples to a list of traits, those counterexamples will be either human or as connected to humans as possible. It's reasonable to say that vegans also understand that being a human or as close to human as possible is on the absurd side of things to eat, while those counterexamples closer to the cow are not worth bringing up.
Okay, so I'm just going to say right out the gate, I don't even know why this is being mentioned. They're just identifying something that the NTT does. It's kind of like if I ask someone, hey, how was your day? And they say, you asked me a question. Yes, that is something I did. And what of it? It's like, yes, the NTT is going to do this. If they're saying or implying that there's some issue with this, there's not. And if they're just curious as to why the NT tier is not going to add anything more than the traits that were given, it's because the goal is to give the strongest reductio that is compatible with their view. So if they, for example, name the trait lacking human genetics, I'm not going to remove anything more than the human genetics from the human, because it would only make the view sound more intuitive than it actually is. And that's not my goal.
Right. So presumably as vegans, we already think that anybody who says that it's okay to factory farm animals, for example, would already have a reductio under review. So in the interest of doing NTT, we're looking for what's perceived or what we take to be the strongest reductio available. And so people have we have all sorts of communal relationships with other humans, etc. People find it intuitive that it would be wrong to treat beings that are adjacent to humans in a certain way. So why not keep a reductio that preserves human adjacency?
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
I
cool.
also want to make I want to make one further point, which is that again, if his goal is to help people engage with NTT, this is not again helping in any way. Somebody could be a proponent of NTT and not give reductios like that, and somebody could, etc. And even if people always do this, merely pointing out that they do it, as Illuminaire mentioned, is not helping anybody deal with the question.
Right. To me, it seems like all those things help people avoid the question, which of course is not Shadow's goal, right?
Exactly, because what this might cause is that somebody might read this post again, as we mentioned. These are potential things given that could happen based off somebody reading these posts and interpreting them in a way that's unintended. Sorry, so
Right.
somebody could read this and they could, they might, when somebody raises the question, that's a reductio or perceived reductio, somebody might respond by saying, why are you invoking human adjacency in your reductio as opposed to using some different reductio? And of course, this is as dumb as asking, why are you asking the question you're asking as opposed to some different one? And it's completely irrelevant to the question being asked. But people might read this and come away thinking that this is somehow a good tactic to use in the discussion, which will only make them perform worse when they're dealing with NTT, contrary to the goals stipulated in the post earlier.
Yeah, I have nothing to add there.
Cool.
That's pretty bad.
Perfect. We so here is the last one. Suppose I'll add this. My particular answers seem to have no unintuitive counterexamples to a lot of people, and no substantive criticism I've received thus far. So if they seem to capture more or less what you value as well, you can adopt them. I have a lot
So,
to say here, but yeah, you go ahead.
okay. I mean, yeah, you should say a lot because apparently you've had personal experience with Starshine and his traits. I'll just mention, look, for one, he's wrong. The traits he's named are very level 0. I saw him talk with Vegan Gains a while back, and he named some pretty bad traits. It was something like lacking human genetics and lacking typical human intelligence, right? As missing either of those is not enough. You have to miss both. This is just going to lead to a reductio where it's okay to factory farm Down syndrome schmoomins. Terrible. That's not going to be intuitive to a lot of people if I had to suspect. I would even bet there's some good data on this if we pulled up survey data on the types of things that people are typically okay with. So I don't think this is going to be intuitive unless his view has changed, but then that would contradict what's been said here. Because if there's never been any counterintuitive examples presented, then his view wouldn't have had to change as a result of NTT. So
Yeah.
number 8 seems pretty dubious.
Well, apparently the view did change. First time I encountered Shadow many years ago, his answer to name the trait was reminds me of a human, right? And one of the funny implications of that is like killing people in Counter-Strike would be immoral because they remind me of a human, right? And presumably him too, right? Or like having a picture on your wall that has like your grandma on it, like it would be wrong if you, I don't know, if the picture fell down and like broke itself, it would be morally wrong. But nevertheless, he, when I've interacted with him in chat, he gave me 2 new answers to name the trait. The first answer is human-like. I believe it's in a disjunct with being self-aware. So now the first trait, human-like, he offered some more clarity, and the clarity is human-like can be similar in appearance, sound, etc., other empirical things. It could be human-like by lineage, having come from a human. This could involve abstract come from, like taking the consciousness out of a human and putting it in X. I have also given examples of Superman, great apes, the latter of which is somewhere near the end of the spectrum in terms of appearance, common lineage. Okay, so like my issue with this is that when you say human-like or animal-like, those are like comparative notions. So I can tell you, I understand it like this. So I can tell you whether or not a monkey is more human-like compared to a stone. And all that would mean is something like this. When I think of those 3 things in comparison, I can find more true shared propositions between the human and the monkey when compared to the human with the stone. So in that sense, the monkey would be more human-like compared to the stone, right? So apparently, like his clarification, similar in appearance. I mean, yeah, similar in sound. I mean, the cow can be similar in sound compared to a human, right? Other empirical things. That trait is like underspecified. But the good thing is, if we show Shadow and like a series of images, he can tell us what things are like human-like and which are not human-like, right? So I think we can get at least some understanding with respect to the trait equalization process where human-like is being lost, right? And then the other trait, which was being self-aware, he mentioned that this has something to do with the ability of having language, right? And that one is like very easy to deal with. And one like counterexample would be like to both traits, even if they're in a disjunction together, right? Like torrents of World of Warcraft, right? Those are not human-like, and let's say they're like cognitively disabled, they don't have the ability to have language, and yeah, he would be okay with killing those. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to mention again, if this is supposed to be the hitchhiker's guide to dealing with NTT, number 8 is definitely not going to help you. And I'm not just saying that because I believe all traits lead to reductio. I am saying that especially because I have seen people name traits that are less embarrassing than Starshines. These are not even close to sort of the best traits that you can possibly name. So this is not conducive to the goal of mitigating the rhetoric of NTT, whatever that vaguely stated goal at the beginning is.
Sure. Cartesian, have anything to
Okay.
comment?
Yeah, so just like to summarize all of this. So, because like we've given a few interpretations of his view, I'm not sure what he said in the past. He might have presented it differently at different points in time. But let's just say if his view is a disjunctive traits, namely humanity, and humanity is going to include human resemblance as well, and self-awareness, right? Then the simple response to this would be to propose a being who lacks humanity, doesn't have resemblance to, a human, right? And we can just stipulate that this being is self-aware to the level of a cow or whatnot. Then we can take somebody who is self-aware to that same level and does have humanity. Now, once again, as mentioned earlier, two beings are cognitively identical, right? They're cognitively identical, but he has different values with regards to their treatment. He's okay with farming the former, he's okay with farming one and not the other. And we can just narrow it down to where the person is just at the brink of holding humanity in terms of human resemblance. And he will still say that despite their cognitive identicality, it's okay to farm one and not the other, and that will be the reductio. A further point about self-awareness is that it's actually not all that clear what he means by self-awareness besides some type of cognitive capability. And I might not even be convinced that animals lack self-awareness, but even if we grant that they do, if we grant that whatever level of self-awareness animals have, it just doesn't meet the bar, you're still able to get a reductio like this.
Right. I actually mentioned that before, not in this discussion, obviously, but in another discussion, that a lot of people will try to make this move where they're saying something like self-awareness or some vague trait related to the experience of the creature. And what they're describing is not only vague, but even though it's vague, it's still definitely false. They'll say something like, the creature is not really conscious or having desires, or it doesn't really experience pain or something like this. And these things just turn out to be false. And they're effectively trying to say something like, oh yeah, these like basically non-conscious humans, I'm not okay with killing. But these basically non-conscious animals, I am okay with killing, which would just be an inaccurate depiction of the state of affairs. And if Starshine wants to get wrecked on the empirics related to that, I'm happy to double dunk on him with that one and anyone else that wants to try to use his traits. Because something that's not very often mentioned with NTT is if you name a trait that's just not true of the cow, such as, oh, it's the trait of not being conscious, that's also going to get you dunked on because now you fail to actually give an accurate answer because that's not a trait true of one and not the other.
Yeah, and like lastly, I want to say something like where those traits would lead to. Like imagine you have two beings that are like cognitively identical to the cow. Like for example, um, like you have the cow on one side, and on the other side you have like mentally disabled like human who has the same cognition as the cow, right? So we would agree, given like Shadow's priors, that they have the same self-awareness. So then we start trait equalizing um, the looks of the human to the cow, right? And presumably when the human like gets like cow head, or he gets I don't know, cow's feet, Shadow would say, yeah, that's not human-like enough, or it doesn't have humanity, right? So basically what I'm saying is he would have to accept basically factory farming or killing for food the torrents from World of Warcraft. That's my point. Or it's gonna end up somewhere there in a very similar territory.
Yeah, so one last point about self-awareness here. I'll just read. So this is the definition of self-awareness he gives on his poorly written fandom page, I believe, where he says the ability to cognitively understand yourself as a concept and slash object in the world. Such a concept generally includes understanding your psychology. I am X kind of person, and your ontology, this is my arm. The capability allows one to gain or hold such an attribution about oneself, such that one thinks I am constantly in the world and wish to continue to be so. I'm not convinced that animals of this kind don't have this property. So, with this response, might undertake an additional burden to give an argument that animals lack this property. And so this, once again, by introducing, properties that it's not clear animals don't have, is plausibly detracting from the performance of people who are engaging with NTT.
Right. That's what I'm talking about when trying to make this move of naming a trait that's not actually true of the animal. It's not going to work.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Well, Shadow, feel free. You're invited to join this server or Cartesian server or any other server. And if you want to respond to that, you're welcome to do so. We are open to talk to you. Also, if we've misinterpreted something, feel free to correct us. That's plausible. That's why we gave multiple interpretations of your points. And yeah, to the vegans out there, just share this video with others so you can avoid, those poor points that Shadow is making, right? We can call his points the guide of avoiding name the trait. Pretty poor guide. And yeah, catch you up in the next one.